I hope you're enjoying this series on Lions of the Faith, Tigers of the Faith. It's interesting because this is all about people who have made a difference. And I suppose the two people that I've been talking about in the series, Chuck Smith, had a big personal effect on me. But I also asked to just talk about C.S. Lewis. Can I just ask you, how many people here have read a book by C.S. Lewis? Okay, so lots of hands up. Right. So I guess this ties in very closely with some of my own personal story. And I hope you don't mind if I give you some, like a testimony, if you like a bit of my life story, and just put it in context why this guy's been important to me and in my spiritual life. I didn't excel at school. I was an odd kid. I suppose it's not surprising. I'm odd now, so being odd when you're a kid. But I went to a grammar school. So I lived in Merton, Pitt Village, and Merton was a strange place. Very, very. I mean, there's working classes you can get. Yeah, there's working classes you can get. One pit. 1 million pubs, a few chapels, and I came from a chapel background, if you like, which made me odd to start with. And parents who had nothing in terms of material goods, but wanted the best for me. I found myself at grammar school at Peterlee, which was a bit strange. Because it was an odd grammar school. It wasn't an ordinary one. It was a grammar technical school, so it was an experiment. And when we got there in 1963 or 4, it was really populated by teachers who all seemed to be as odd as everybody else. They were a really strange bunch. There was loads of people who were ex-forces, from after the war, who clearly hadn't settled on anything else. Discipline was largely, one teacher used to throw a gym slipper at your head from wherever you were. He was incredible aim. He could hit anybody instantly with this, and they used to, of course, have the cane and everything else. But I'd gone to this grammar school, but I'd never sat me 11 plus. I was the first of this breed, if you like, that started to go through teachers saying, I think he'll thrive there rather than here. But largely at school, I didn't. And I probably wouldn't have passed me 11 plus. And then I had this other strange thing, because not only did I come from a church background, but when I was 14, I made a decision to become a Christian. And that, again, separated me from just about everybody else until I found a small bunch of other people in the school who were also Christians. And we had our own tight little clique, if you like, And then what happened was although I'd made a decision at 14 and was, avid about telling everybody about Christ at school, which meant, people used to laugh as they would. But when I got to 16, I went down to the park in Sunderland, and the hippies had just started. I've told some of this story before, so forgive me if it overlaps. But the hippie movement was really underway. The big Summer of Love, Woodstock, was happening in America. And so I went to the park in Sunderland, and ostensibly it was to sort of share my faith with them, but really it wasn't. Really it was far more because I was interested in what they had to say to me rather than the other way around. Do you know what I mean? And then we found, for example, that there were growing marijuana plants inside the park. Which was interesting because at those days nobody knew where it was, so the park keepers used to tend it, So they even got into the greenhouses, and so the park keepers are running the best hash plants that you've seen, great care. And of course everybody was into drugs, and I've got to say, it was a different type of drugs culture. It wasn't sort of like, well, let's get your head out of this. And, it wasn't that. What it was about was this massive thing where people said you could use drugs to find God, right? Now, I'd already found God, or God had found me, but people were using drugs in a different way, I guess. And I don't know if you remember the 60s, if you do, but there was a guy called Timothy Leary. Timothy Leary was a professor at Berkeley, I think, yeah, Berkeley. And he came up with the slogan, tune in, turn on, and drop out. And the idea was, take LSD and your life will be different forever. And that was true for a lot of people, not the way necessarily they wanted it to be. But I found the whole idea of experiment with drugs very, very interesting. And it led to a horrible 2 years of my life when I was living rough and taking anything I could find and getting mixed up with bands and all that. And I don't want to talk about that. And thank God, God delivered me from it. But what happened was that I came back to sit my A levels as an 18-year-old, having not studied at all anything. And when I did my exam papers for chemistry and physics, I just did cartoons over the whole of the exam paper. So I was probably the first person to get nothing for the A-level result. You know what I mean? I just knew nothing, and just, as I say, I'd blown my education. I guess that's the point I'm trying to come to. And because I hadn't sort of thrived at school, I had this feeling that I was dumb and not intelligent and a failure, I guess. And I started the lowest job possible in the civil service because of a favour. Basically, my mum and dad knew a preacher who was also an MP and then had been elevated to head of the Queen's estates. In fact, he was the guy that his office was in Buckingham Palace, and he looked after all of the affairs of the Queen. And so my mum and dad asked him if he would do a reference for us. So you can imagine, I had a reference to start the civil service on Buckingham Palace notepaper. And when on the first day I started work, my boss picked this letter up and said, well, you could just see he was absolutely speechless because he couldn't figure out why I would have this. So there I am, 18-year-old, starting in the civil service, lowest possible job, a filing clerk. I'd met Athena by that time, and we'd become engaged. But I, in my heart, really just felt I'd lost something. I'd found, the most important thing in my life. But I recognized I'd missed something as well. And I started to read. And I've got to say that education is an incredibly powerful thing. I can't minimize the importance of education. I really can't. But sometimes it happens privately. Do you know what I mean? Self-taught, people say. But I started to read, and the first guy that I picked up a book that changed me was C.S. Lewis, the guy we're going to be talking about today. And he led me to another author called Francis Schaeffer, and if we'd had time on the series, I'd love to have talked about Francis Schaeffer. But those two people and their writings, if you like, revolutionized my life. And I was a fan of Tolkien. Anybody here like Tolkien? Lord of the Rings? Yeah. Well, interestingly enough, Tolkien and C.S. Lewis were best of pals. And they were Oxford professors together. And them together with another guy called Charles Williams, who was also an author. They all got together in a pub called the Eagle and Child, and they had a little writing group called the Inklings, and they started writing together. And basically, I'll tell the story of Lewis in a second, but you'll see where that becomes important. And Lewis becomes this person who is often held up as one of the smartest Christians around. Now, I don't want to overdo that, but certainly this is true, the originality of his writings and the originality and elegance, I guess, of his work is absolutely incredible. So he was born in 1898. He was nicknamed Jack, named after his dog, strangely enough. His nickname was Jack. Clive Stapleton Lewis, Staples Lewis. But everybody called him Jack. And as I say, I think his dog died when he was about 4-year-old, and he always took the name of the dog after that. Strange thing. He later became a fellow and tutor in English literature at Oxford University until 1954, and then he was elevated to the chair of medieval and Renaissance literature at Cambridge, which is a position he held till his retirement. So he's a smart guy, absolutely. He writes more than 30 books, and these reach an incredibly vast audience. And actually, the amount of people who read Lewis expands year after year after year. And some of the greatest things he did, he started something called, he wrote something called Mere Christianity. And it's a book of what we call apologetics, Christian apologetics. Let's try and explain what we mean by that. It doesn't mean to say you're apologizing. What it is about is arguments about God and about Christianity. It defends the faith, if you like. And the great thing is, when you read Lewis, there's loads of things you can pick up that become really useful in everyday conversation. Do you know what I mean? If you want to start with Lewis, try Mere Christianity. He writes in an old-fashioned way, and I'll explain some of the background in a minute. He often talks about the war. But the reason is that the book Mere Christianity was started in radio lectures that he gave during the Second World War. And that's why it has some of that in it. But I've got to say that if you're interested in learning how to defend your faith, of what the intellectual side of our faith is, he's brilliant. And if you're like me, you didn't have an education, you can still pick the book up and learn. And one of the incredible things I've got to say that I absolutely, totally believe is the Christian faith elevates your thinking. Might sound crackers, but when you become a Christian, if you're interested and want to read, you actually become more intelligent. Does that sound strange? But you do. You become more intelligent the more you're engaged with things, and the brain is just like a muscle. You know, I've got certain flabby muscles, which are very obvious, but you can train your brain into, with exercise, if you like. And, Lewis didn't just write about apologetics. He wrote science fiction series. He wrote Out of the Silent Planet, 3 books I'll mention. He wrote a brilliant book called The Great Divorce, which was about a day trip from hell to heaven, which I'll explain. He wrote the Screwtape Letters, which apparently was letters from a demon to an older demon, giving advice on how to trip Christians up. It's not really about demons, it's really about the tricks that the devil uses, if you like. And of course he wrote the Chronicles of Narnia. Have you seen the Chronicles of Narnia, the film? Waggle your hands if you have. Yeah, few people, more people have seen the film. And what's interesting about Lewis is that he takes the ideas of parables quite seriously. Jesus used parables all the time. What do we mean by a parable? A parable is a story, an ordinary story, if you like, but with a special hidden meaning about spiritual things. And that's what Lewis did. So in his science fiction, he's writing ordinary stories, but he's telling incredible truths. And in fact, I guess he was, as I say, a great expert. He was born in Belfast. His father was Lister. His mother was, they were Irish. She was from sort of Welsh roots. Lewis, as a boy, was fascinated with sort of Beatrix Potter and stories of animals becoming human type of thing, that sort of crossover world. He loved to read. His father's house was filled with books. He said that finding a book was as easy as, in that house, was as easy as walking into a field and finding a new blade of grass. In other words, there were just books absolutely everywhere. And it was during this time that Lewis abandoned his childhood Christian faith and became an atheist, and was very, very interested in the mythic and the mythology, especially of the Irish. And then he got really involved in Norse legends and stuff like that, and he became a specialist, which is why he eventually sort of found the job he did within universities. In the First World War, he started Oxford University, and then he had to go to France and fight in the First World War, and his experience of the horror of war confirmed his atheism. So this guy was an absolutely outspoken atheist. If you think about Richard Dawkins today, Lewis was that type of person. He would speak out constantly against Christianity. After the war, he went back and received a first in honours in Greek and Latin. Then the next year he received first in Great. The next year he received a first in English. And in 1924 he became a tutor at the college. In his writings, he turns around and says that when he was 15, rather oddly, he says, he felt angry with God for not existing. Do you like that? He felt angry with God for not existing. Anyhow, story moves on. He starts to meet with Tolkien and Charles Williams. And they go to the pub, the Eagle and Child pub in Oxford, and I've sat in the same seats they used to sit in. And Tolkien was busy writing Lord of the Rings. Now, Tolkien was a Christian. And he would talk about his faith to Lewis. And Charles Williams, if you read his books, great books as well. And he was a Christian. He would talk about his faith to Lewis. And Lewis was really annoyed, vigorously resisted Christianity. And in fact, he became really worried because he had a sneaking suspicion that God was starting to speak to him, and it freaked him out. He says, I was kicking, struggling, resentful, darting my eyes in every direction for a chance to escape. And he describes his last struggle in his book called Surprised by Joy. And he says this, you must picture me alone in that room at Magdalen College, Oxford, night after night, feeling my mind lifted from a second from my work, the steady, unrelenting approach of him who I so earnestly desired not to meet. That which I greatly feared had come on me at last. In the Trinity term of 1929, I gave in, admitted that God was God, and knelt and prayed. And that night was the most dejected and reluctant convert in all of England. But strangely enough, what he converted to originally was a belief in God. He was won over by the arguments of Tolkien and Williams. And he thought through, and I'll tell you some of his thinking process in a minute. But he came to the conclusion that there was a God. But that didn't bring him to Christianity. Do you understand? So first thing I want to say is it's possible for someone to believe in God and not be a Christian. And it's important that we don't just preach belief in God. It's important that we preach Jesus. Right? And he held out on that for another 2 years. And then in 1931, he records making a specific commitment to Christ while on the way to his zoo with his brother. And at that point in time, he invited Jesus into his life. That is the thing that changed everything for him. But it's interesting, people's spiritual journeys, isn't it? I don't know what your spiritual journey is. I don't know whether you are... Because sometimes we get guests who come along to church. And sometimes the guests that come to church walk in and say to themselves, I don't believe in anything. And they come in almost wanting to say, look at the daft Christians. And some people find themselves overwhelmed by a sense, well, there is a God. Okay, I accept there's a God. But that doesn't do us any good unless we come to specifically understanding who Jesus is and accepting Jesus into our life. I'm going to just talk you through some of the ideas that Lewis had, and you can see whether those ideas make sense to you or not. And if they do, maybe you want to pick up a book and start reading. From 1941 to 43, in the middle of the Second World War, Lewis started some BBC radio talks. And originally he'd volunteered for active service as a soldier, but his offer was turned down. The recruiting office said, "Why don't you write for the Ministry of Information?" But Lewis said, "I'm not doing that. I don't want to write lies to deceive the enemy." His Christianity wouldn't let him tell lies. He later serves in the local Home Guard in Oxford. And now I've got this weird idea of C.S. Lewis as sort of, I don't know, Pike or whatever, you know. And then Lewis is invited, as I said, to the BBC to speak and do some thoughts on Christianity. And it had a massive response. Air Chief Marshal Sir Donald Hardman said, "The war, the whole of life, everything seemed to be pointless. We needed, many of us, a key to the meaning of the universe." And Lewis provided just that. And these broadcasts later became the book that is Mere Christianity. Then something amazing happened in his life that he didn't expect. Because by now he's getting on in years, he's in his late 40s. And he comes in touch with a woman called Joy Davidman. And she was a former communist. She was a convert from atheism to Christianity. She was separated from her alcoholic and abusive husband, the novelist William Gresham, and came to England with her 2 sons. And she meets Lewis, and they get on like a house on fire. But they're just pals. They're just mates. But Lewis regards her as an intellectual companion and personal friend. And then she's going to be sent back to the States. So he agrees to enter into a civil marriage with her so she can stay in the UK. So there's no romance at this point. He's just agrees to marry this woman to keep her in the UK but so she could stay at Oxford. And then his brother said she was the only woman who Jack had met who had a brain which matched his own in wit and humour, in the grasp of and a sense of fun. And a short while after that, she complained of a painful hip and was diagnosed with bone cancer. And at that point, he realized that he was absolutely in love with her. It took that before he realized. And at that point, they went and they got properly married. Her cancer went into remission for a short while, and then she died. It's interesting because Lewis wrote a book called A Grief Observed, which is so raw. Anybody who is going through pain of loss, I would recommend this book. It's such a raw, personal fashion. He decided to release it in somebody else's name, so he gave a different name to the author. He took the name N.W. Clerk to keep from his many readers associated with that book. And the irony is that many of his friends bought the book and brought it to Lewis and said, "Here, this might help you." He said of Joy, and the strange thing, he'd written a book called Surprised by Joy the year before he met her, about his conversion to Christianity. And then met somebody called Joy, and a lot of people think the book's about her. It's not. But he says of her, "She was my daughter, my mother, my pupil, my teacher, my subject, my sovereign, and always, holding all these, my trusty companion, friend, shipmate, fellow soldier, mistress, and at the same time, as all of that, the best friend that any man could ever have." He was absolutely devastated when she died. And he died, actually, surprisingly, shortly afterwards. He was only 64, actually the same age that I am now, which is a spooky feeling. He died a week before his 65th birthday. The media coverage of his death was nearly went missed. Nobody really reported it, because in the same hour that he died, John F. Kennedy was assassinated in Dallas, Texas. So the newspapers were full of the death of Kennedy, and hardly anybody realized that he had died. So, let me just try and explain some of the things he said. And he wrote the book Mere Christianity after these broadcasts, and what he said was, I want to try and answer those objections that people come up with against Christianity. So, for example, the question, how could a good God allow pain to exist in the world? Have you ever thought that? Have people ever said that to you? If you want to have a really good, well-reasoned answer to it, I strongly suggest have a read of Mere Christianity. He argued that great argument that you'll have heard in loads of sermons about this idea of who Jesus is. And what he said was essentially, some people turn around and say something very foolish. They say, I'm ready to accept Jesus as a moral teacher, but I don't accept his claim to be God. And Lewis said this, we cannot say that. A man who was merely a man and said the type of things that Jesus said could not be a great moral teacher. Because if you think about it, Jesus said some strange things, didn't he? He said, I laid down my life and I pick it back up again. Yeah? He said that he was one with God. He said that he saw Abraham in his day. Yeah? He made claims to be the Son of God. And what Lewis said, hang on, if anyone says that, you can't say they're a great moral teacher, because if somebody says that they're God, he must either be a lunatic on the level of the man who says he's a poached egg, right? Or a devil from hell. You must make your choice. Either this man was and is the Son of God, or else a madman or something worse. You can shut him up for a fool, you can spit at him, you can kill him as a demon, or you can fall at his feet and call him Lord and God. But let's not come with any patronizing nonsense about him being a great human teacher. He has not left that open to us, and he did not intend to. Now, I know loads of preachers, including myself, have borrowed these words and this argument, because it's an incredibly powerful argument. Who is Jesus? If Jesus said he was God and wasn't, then dismiss him. And I've got to say that this morning. Christianity is either right or it should be booted out of your life. Because it's crazy or it's true. But there's no middle ground between it. Christianity isn't something that's sort of worthwhile and nice to have. It's not. Christianity is as revolutionary and different from everything that else is going around about you. And it will clash constantly with the message that you'll read in the newspapers and hear on TV. It isn't a nice thing. It's either true or it's crazy. And I guess the challenge is, and this was Lewis found, he was an honest guy. You've got to make the choice. It might be a choice you don't want to face up to. It might be a choice that scares you, but ultimately we've got to make the choice. Is Jesus who he says he was, or is he crazy? And if he's crazy, walk away and don't look back. But if it's true, if Jesus did love you, and if his love drove him to die in your place, if Jesus truly is God, the creator of the universe, and he knows you inside out, everything about you, sees all the mistakes and still loves you, how can you turn away from him? Lewis continues to attract wide readership. He was listed in 2008 as the 50th greatest writer since 1945. He keeps moving up the rankings because more and more people read Lewis. He was finally recognized in Poets' Corner, Westminster Abbey, and one of his quotes is written on the floor of Westminster Abbey and says this: I believe in Christianity as I believe the sun has risen, not because I see it, but because by it I see everything else. So let's just look in particular one of the ways he became a convert. The first thing he said was this. There are 2 points I want to make. First, human beings all over the earth have this curious idea that they ought to behave in a certain way, and they can't get rid of it. They know that they don't behave, in fact, that way. They know the law of nature and break it. And these 2 facts are the foundation of all clear thinking about ourselves in the universe. Let me just try and point out what I mean. You mightn't believe in God, you mightn't believe in anything, but if you're queuing in the post office and somebody gets in front of you who's just walked in, what do you feel like? And you say something like this, "It's not right." Is that right? It's not right. Why has he done that? There's a blind guy who's busking, and he's got some money in his hat. Somebody walks along and lifts a fiver out of it and walks on. And you stand and you see it. What are you going to say? "Oh, look at that. That's not right. Did you see where he did?" And it's especially true when it's about us. Yeah? Someone steals your car parking space because you were just about to drive into it. What Lewis is saying is this: there is something that resides in all of our hearts that actually tells us something is right. Isn't that strange? We instinctively know, and it's not just about manners, although manners might be a reflection of it, but we instinctively know the truth about things. And then he goes on that second part to say, but the other truth we know is, we know what is good behavior, but we also know that we don't live by it enough. Is that right? We might want to shout at other people when they jump in a car park space that's not theirs, but we also know we've got an inclination to do what? Jumping it ourselves first. Do you understand? So what Lewis's starting point off with his idea was this: hang on, how can there not be a God if there is a sense of right and wrong in everybody? And it seems to be universal. His argument, he says this: my argument against God was that the universe seemed so cruel and unjust. But how had I got the idea of just and unjust? A man doesn't call a line crooked unless he has some idea of a straight line. What was I comparing the universe with when I said it was unjust? You get it? Suppose there's no intelligence behind the universe, no creative mind. In that case, nobody designed my brain for the purpose of thinking. It's merely the atoms inside my skull, chemical, physical reactions, arrange themselves in a certain way. And the byproduct is a sensation I call thought. But if so, how can I trust my thinking to be true? It's like upsetting a milk jug and hoping that the way it splashes itself will give you a map of London. I can't trust my own thinking. I can't trust the arguments leading to atheism, and therefore I've got no reason to be an atheist or anything else. Unless I believe in God, I cannot believe in thought, and so I can never use thought to disbelieve God. I probably won't read that again. You know, it's funny because on a morning, Athena and myself, we do our Bible readings together, and we often use a book with C.S. Lewis quotes in it. And there's times when I read it and I know she's with me. Yeah? And there's times I can realize she's just totally switched off because I've read too long a chunk. But this is what first led him to this idea. It was this just really back to basics. Anyhow, he becomes converted. And some of the things he starts to say, as I say, are really incredible. The moment you have a self at all, there's a possibility of putting yourself first, of wanting to be the center, of wanting to be God, in fact. That was the sin of Satan, the sin he taught the human race. Some people think the fall of man had to do with sex, but that's a mistake. What Satan put into the heads of our remote ancestors was the idea that they could be like gods, could set themselves up on their own as if they'd created themselves, be their own masters, invent some sort of happiness for themselves outside from God and apart from God. And out of that hopeless attempt has come the long, terrible story of man trying to find something other than God to make him happy. The Christian is in a different position from other people who are trying to be good. They hope by being good to please God if there is one, and if they think there's not, or at least to win the approval of other men. But the Christian thinks any good he does comes from the Christ life inside him. He doesn't think that God will love us because we are good, but that God will make us good because he loves us. This is going to be a short message this morning because I find myself looking at this and thinking to myself, well, the more I read out, I think the more probably I'll lose people. But I will say this. One of the problems that Lewis had to start with when he became a Christian was that he had no fondness for going to church. He found sermons dull. He disliked the hymns. And organ music he described as one loud roar. He went at first because he felt he ought to, because the scriptures that he believed in said that he had to. He described hymns as second or sixth rate music. He described meetings as tedious. But he started to go. And he went because he recognized the scriptures said that we share the bread and the wine together. He says, when I first became a Christian 14 years ago, I thought I could do it all on my own by retiring to my rooms and reading theology. I wouldn't go to churches and gospel halls. I disliked the hymns, sixth-rate music. But when I started going, I realized I came up with different people with different outlooks, and my conceit started to peel away. And basically he understood that one of the things about church is that we are all together, united in a way that he didn't understand to start with. That we are members together of Christ. The world uses the word members, but it was first used in a Christian context. Jesus said, you are all members of the body of Christ. And that means there is something really important about this gathering that we have together. He became very critical about people who went around different churches. He said, the search for a suitable church makes man a critic where God wants him to be a pupil. He said the perfect church service would be one we're almost unaware of because our attention would have been on God. The church exists for nothing else but to draw men to Christ and to make them little Christs. If you're not doing that, all the cathedrals, clergy, missions, sermons, and even the Bible itself is a waste of time. God became man for no other purpose. The purpose of gathering together is for us to become like Christ. It's easy to think of church having a lot of different objects: education, building, mission, services. And he made a comparison to state, and it's something, again, that I think is really strong. He says it's easy to think of the state as lots of different objects: military, political, economic. But it's much simpler than that. He says the purpose of the state is simply to promote and protect ordinary happiness of human beings in this life. I've never thought of that before, but that's the purpose of government. Did you know that? Purpose of government is just simply that: to protect the ordinary happiness of human beings in their life. A man and wife chatting over a fire, people having a game or reading in his book. That's what the state's for. And unless they're helping to prolong and promote that, all the courts and armies and everything else are a waste of time. In the same way, the church exists for nothing else but to draw men to Christ and to make them into little Christs. God made us. He invented us as a man invented the car. A car is made to run on petrol and it won't run properly on anything else. God designed the human machine to run on himself. He himself is the fuel of our spirits, though we desire it to burn. The food for our spirits. There is no other. There's no way you can go to God to ask him to make us happy in our own way without bothering about religion. God can't give happiness and peace apart from himself because it's not there. Repentance means unlearning all the self-conceit and self-will. It means killing a part of yourself and undergoing a part of death. Give up self, and you'll find the real self. Lose life, and you'll save it. Submit to death, death of your ambitions and favorite wishes. Every day, the death of your whole body. Submit, and every fiber of your being, you will find eternal life. Keep nothing back. Nothing that you've not given away will ever really be yours. And nothing in you that hasn't died will ever be raised from the dead. We needn't despair at our worst and our failures. The only fatal thing is to sit down content with anything less than perfection. He said something, again, very important. If you don't get anything else this morning from a practical point of view, think of this. God, good and evil both increase at a compound rate. The little decisions you and I make every day are of infinite importance. The smallest good act today is the capture of a strategic point from which a few months later you might go on to victories of which you've never dreamed. An apparent trivial indulgence and lust to anger today is the loss of a bridgehead from which the enemy might attack. He gave advice to people in marriage. He said the idea of Christian marriage is that the man and woman are to become a single organism, one flesh, if you like. Think of it like this, a key and a lock, or a single thing, or a violin and a bow, or a musical instrument. And somebody came to him and said, what do you do if you find yourself in a marriage but you no longer love your partner? He said this, and it's incredibly wise. When you behave as if you love somebody, you will presently come to love them. If you injure somebody you dislike, you'll find themselves disliking them more. If you do somebody a good turn who you dislike, you'll find themselves actually liking them more. Love in this second sense, love distinct from being in love, is not merely a feeling, it's a unity maintained by will and by strength of habit and reinforced by God. In other words, if we have to understand that love is something that we choose to do. If your marriage is dead, or if your marriage is dying, his advice is quite simple. Go home and act as if it is wonderful. Act it out. Live it out. Because love is actually choice. And when you do those things, suddenly the emotion will come flooding in afterwards. Does that make sense? He says, and if it works with man and wife, it also works with God. If you feel like you can't love God, act as if you do. And you'll suddenly find that the emotion, if you like, comes in on its heels. This is just me now, not him, but I've got to say that, look, we are called to live our lives as an example. And, you know, drama after drama and story after story, whether it's in the people that we meet or whether it's on television or it's in books or whatever, we see the hideous consequences of people not standing by their word to love, honor, and obey each other. We're interested in starting a children's home. When we talk about children's homes and the difficulties that they present And some people in here have some very, very hard experiences of this. But most children come from marriages that have failed, or were never there to start with. Can I just say that broken homes cause such pain that some people never recover from the damage that's done. We need, I'm going off from what I planned to say, but we need men. Fellas, maybe we should have a good men's meeting sometime. Be true to your word. To love, to cherish your wife. Ladies, be true to your word. And if you find your heart is pulled in another direction to somebody else that you could love, let me say this, it's a choice. And it's a choice that works by your actions. Choose to do the thing that's right, because the damage that springs from a broken family is absolutely devastating. And I like to say, I don't know why I'm talking about this morning. If it applies to somebody in particular, let me say this. I'm going to sound like a flipping country song. Stand by your man. Fellas, be honorable. Love your wife. Love your wife, it says in the Bible, as much as Christ loved his church. Fellas, say it again. Love your wife as much as Christ loved the church. How much is that? Christ loved the church more than he loved himself. Love your wife more than you love yourself. Love her. I don't mean go sentimental. I don't mean go slushy. That might be part of it. But act upon that love. Put her in your mind on a pedestal. If you've been hurt, forgive. If you've been hurt to the core by things that have been said in anger, forgive. If you've been hurt to the core by things that have been done which you cannot get out of your mind, forgive. Women, forgive. Let God heal what gets broken. Let Christ restore what gets damaged. Act in love. We're all broken people, aren't we? Lewis knew it. I know it. Our lives don't work out the way we expect. We have a plan when we're kids. If we could only go back and talk to our younger self, what would we say? But let me say this, Jesus loves you. He died for you on the cross. He died so that you could have peace. He died so that you could have forgiveness. And he died so you could be changed. The steps to him are quite simple. Listen to his voice that's speaking in your heart. Accept the words. Accept the fact that he's telling you this is true. That natural law that we understand of right and wrong, that natural voice is actually in him in the first place. It entered into man the minute mankind ate of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And every man since knows right from wrong instinctively inside. We can bury it with layers of practices and customs. You can override it. The first time somebody wants to steal something, they walk away feeling guilty. By the 50th time they do it, they don't even think twice. Because we can harden our hearts. But instinctively, if we go back to that early self, we knew the difference of right and wrong. The man that goes out and cheats on his wife the first time he did it feels guilty. The 70th time he doesn't, he mightn't at all. But we know that voice of right and wrong. It's our starting point in our journey to God. And that journey might take us the way Lewis did. It might come to say, okay, I believe there is a God. Creation makes no sense unless there is a God. But then you've got to come to decide who that God is. Let me tell you, Buddha is not a God and never said he was. Muhammad said that he wasn't a God. Confucius said he wasn't a God. I'm running out of characters. But let me say this, Jesus said he was. And Jesus is either speaking the truth or he's crazy. But believe me, the people in here know that Jesus is speaking the truth. And if we surrender our hearts to God, we have to live for him. Suddenly, we have to understand, God doesn't want a little bit of you. He doesn't want a tiny part of you. He wants everything. He wants every single thing that you've got to offer. He wants you to surrender completely to him. He wants you not only to bend the knee, but to bow down. He wants you to come to the place where you give everything to him. Why? Because he can't do what he wants to do with you unless you do. What he wants to do is turn you into something like him. How can he do that if some part of you isn't given to him? If you come to church and say, Lord Jesus, be Lord of my life, but you won't surrender that secret sin that you've got, that you hide from everybody else, how can he turn you into what he wants you to be? As Lewis said, if it doesn't die, it can't be resurrected. That thing that you don't want to give up because it gives you pleasure, he can't do the resurrection or he wants in your life unless you surrender it. You know, the church will survive the galaxies. The church will survive the stars and the sky and the sun and the moon. The church will go forever and ever and ever. He wants to make you fit for heaven. Not by the things that you can do, but by what he wants to do with you and in you and for you. I don't want to embarrass people, and so I'm not going to ask people to make a decision to give up secret sins, because it's inevitable that everybody looks around going, they've got a secret sin. I'm not going to turn around and say, if you're playing around and you're messing around with other relationships you shouldn't be in, I'm not going to say stand up and walk the front. I am going to do this. Don't you dare take that bread and the wine now until you put yourself right with God. And when you take the bread and the wine, remember this. It's an act of forgiveness. You don't have to be perfect to take that. You just have to surrender to take that. The bread and the wine is something that we do in remembrance of him because of what he has done for us.